Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you. I was afraid that being the first session after the appreciation event and the last day of the week would be like 6 people here, so thank you very much. And I hope you get your time's worth of this presentation. Standard disclaimer when I talk about future. A little bit about myself. My name is Aurelio Garcia-Ribeyro. I'm a director of product management with Oracle, and I've been with the Java SE group since joining Oracle through the Sun acquisition. Before that, I was with Sun Microsystems, also in the Java product management group, but not directly related to the JDK. Starting in 2010, I've been in charge of Java Standard Edition, so I wrote the product requirement documents for JDK 7 and 8, and we didn't do product requirement documents in 9. We'll talk a little bit about that. We started using a different model. One of my roles within Oracle is to spoil surprises. I don't want to surprise anybody with a future change. So we try to announce things with plenty of time and repeat them. And of course, we sometimes fail. And I figure you guys would appreciate pretty much some of the same information, and we'll tell you a little bit of what we do to try to keep things predictable in something as unpredictable as changing software, right? You've seen these slides before. We try to be open. The important two things now are evolving and nimble. Now, you've all, I assume, worked on several software projects. And for us, for the Java platform, adding things is relatively easy, right? Changing something is very hard, because by the time we want to change something, a lot of you guys are relying on it, and it could be a very painful experience. And removing something, it's almost impossible. We hadn't removed anything, really, at volume before JDK 9. And there's a very good reason for that, but it also makes it very costly. And at some point, you do have to evolve, and you do have to remove things. So we're working to provide you with a more nimble JDK. And you all heard about the release model, the changes. Now we're coming out every 6 months. Last year, when I was presenting, I was talking about we're about to, actually, I think we had just released, or we're about to release JDK 9. Now JDK 9 has reached end of life. JDK 10 has reached end of life. And we're talking about JDK 11. So that was, quite a change for us. I still see a bunch of books out there written about JDK 9 because, everybody expected it'll be around for, 11 years. So just a recap of what the change was, and I'll just power through these because I'm sure you've seen these exact same slides like 27 times already. We used to have a model which was one major version every 2 years. And I say the model was every 2 years because in reality, we tended to move that out, and it was sometimes as long as 5 years or so. And some, the first releases were about 2 years apart. The later ones, 2, 3, sometimes 5. Now, during the first part of the release, when the release was the only current release, we would have update releases and we would add functionality. So the model was GA, about 6 months after that, let's come up with an update. 6 months after that, another one. 6 months after that, another update. And after that, no more updates on that version. From that point on, it was only bug fixes, except for a few minor exceptions, like you do have to backport support for TLS 1.2, for example, to an old version that didn't have any secure version once we dropped TLS 1.1, right? But from that point on, all of the new functionality went in the next release, and it was supposed to be about 6 months after the last minor update, okay? So under the old model, this is what would have happened after 8. 6 months after 8, we would have had 9. And then 6 months after that, 9.1, 9.2, 9.3. Now, who here remembers Plan A, Plan B, and all of the angst about what happens with Jigsaw? What was the original release on which Jigsaw was planned to come out? Anybody remember? 7. I do have slide decks where Jigsaw is coming out on 7. I remember the messages saying, oh, it's not going to be ready, it's going to go into 8. And then the one saying, now it's going to go into 9, and then saying 9 has to be delayed, right? And that's quite painful. Because even though 9 had to be delayed because of Jigsaw, there were several features in JDK 9 that were ready on time. They were ready long before 9 was GA'd. They were ready before 9 was scheduled to GA, and yet they had to be delayed. If you look at the list of JEPs on JDK 9, you will find that we introduced support for Unicode 7. And if you look a little lower in the list, you will find that we added support for Unicode 8. Because 8 was out before JDK 9 was delivered. So, we really don't need that. If the theoretical model allowed us to have updates and new functionality every 6 months, we could just produce a 9, 9.1, 9.2, 9.3 every 6 months. The problem with this is, you guys remember, we have to change the specification in order to rev the first digit. There's a whole Java community process for this, so we cannot just willy-nilly change APIs on a dot release. And that meant that if we had used this model and just have 9.1, 9.2, 9.3, certain releases would have been special, right? You would have had these set of features that would have had to wait until JDK 10. So, given that we're going to a 6-month release cadence, let's go all in, right? We're not going to have a special release. We're not going to say certain features can only happen on even numbers or odd numbers or anything like that. Any change or feature cannot go in any of these releases. Now, some of them are special. We cannot support every single one of these releases for the long time that we supported the previous ones, right? And even if we could, it probably would be a bad idea to do it, because we'd end up with this fragmented space where a bunch of people are in 9, another in 10, another in 11. Now, luckily, this is a problem that has already been solved. A bunch of operating systems and even browsers and other products and platforms came up with the idea long before we did. Let's have a few of those releases be long-term support. And we will offer long-term only on those, and the others, for lack of a better word, we call them non-LTS, non-long-term support. The next question after this is, of course, well, how often should you produce a long-term support release? And if we went and tried to come up with a poll, we would have some developers would say, well, once a year sounds about right. Every other release should be a long-term. Some large customers that they really don't want new features. They just want to stay on the old version. They care for stability. And they won't even adopt a new version until it's been out for a couple of years anyways. They thought, the time between 7 and 8, 5 years, that sounds about right. There's no consensus. So what we went with was, well, what's the average that we've been doing? Because that's what the industry has already adapted to. And we said, well, on average, we've been doing every 3 years, a major version. So let's have an LTS every 3 years. It's worth noting, by the way, that this is what we propose to do for our LTSs. There's nothing stopping anybody from, if 14 happens to be a particularly interesting release, some members of the OpenJDK community could decide to support it for longer. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why you cannot have special rules. I've heard people say, oh, you can only remove something on an LTS. Not really, right? LTS is just at the tail end. For the purposes of planning, all releases are the same. This is not retroactive, so we're not going to drop support for prior versions any sooner, right? And to make things a little bit more complicated, we also introduced the concept of OpenJDK binaries. Now, up to and including JDK 8, Oracle did almost all of the work that we did in Java in OpenJDK. But then we didn't build from OpenJDK. We grabbed some closed code, and we layered that on top of what was available in OpenJDK. So the Oracle JDK was a superset, right? We introduced functionality that was not available in there, and some of it, we charge for it. Anybody here has tried mission control and flight recorder? Yeah, a few people have. Or you've seen application class data sharing that was available in JDK 10 onwards. It was available for Oracle JDK from 8 onwards as an experimental feature at the time. But those were commercial features. The source code for that was not in OpenJDK, and if you grabbed a build from OpenJDK, you wouldn't be able to use those. Truth is, that sort of works when you have a major release every 2 or 3 years, but trying to keep these closed code and open code in sync when you're going to do releases every 6 months, that doesn't work. So we decided, okay, we really need one binary. Now, we were not done with the one binary. By the time we made the decision, it was too late to provide a one binary for 9. It was even too late to do it for 10. It was only 6 months after 9 anyways. People have this idea that, hey, open sourcing code, it's just, you grab the code from closed, you cut and paste it, now it's in OpenJDK, it's open, right? But it's a little bit more complicated than that. You have to make sure that, for example, you have the rights to open source in the proper license, all of the third-party components that you include. You have to clean up your code, right? You might take some shortcuts when you have some closed code that you wouldn't want to put out in there in the open. So it takes some time and effort. And that's why it took us until JDK 11 to achieve true parity. For the OpenJDK binaries that we produced for 9, didn't include some of the commercial features that were in the Oracle JDK 9. Same is true for JDK 10. JDK onwards, they're now the same thing. They're built from the same code base, right? It's all in OpenJDK, and we've produced 2 binaries, mainly to keep things simple. Now, there are some very small differences. There is a blog, if you guys want to search for Java Product Management blog. There's an entry which is pretty close to the GA date, a little before the GA of JDK 11. Donald Smith, he actually calls out what the differences are. And I'm not kidding, they're very small. So if you run a Java minus version, the Oracle JDK says Java, the OpenJDK one says OpenJDK. How do you handle certain flags? Let me give you an example. When you say, I want to compile with APIs from an earlier version, JDK 9, Oracle JDK 9, included, for example, JavaFX and the flight recorder APIs. So if you pass that flag to the Oracle JDK 11, it'll know that those were valid APIs. If you do the same with OpenJDK 11, since those were never part of OpenJDK, those will not be possible. So we still need a little bit more time to iron out those differences, which are mostly so that people that were relying on one versus the other have time to transition. But for all practical purposes, you can just use either of them. And the difference now is just the license, and the more obvious difference is how long we're going to support it. This is a different way of looking at this. The one on top, that's OpenJDK releases under GPL. You can see we're always producing the latest. The ones at the bottom are the Oracle JDK ones. Okay? If you squint, you can see that the ones at the bottom look very similar to what we did before, right? If you treat the non-LTS releases as if they were minor update, they're not, by the way. They're not a minor update. You can have changes there anyways. But, it's a similar process. And now we hope we have a model where we address the need for, we have to have features more frequently than every 3 years, while at the same time providing you with a path if you need to stay on a release for, 5, 6 years. Okay? This means, by the way, that we expect most people will go from using the Oracle JDK to the same OpenJDK binaries that we provide. They're hosted in jdk.java.net. Now, this also implies a bunch of other changes. First of all, late binding of features. We used to do sort of a waterfall model. So when JDK 8 came out, we had a pretty good idea of what was coming out on JDK 9. Or so we thought, of course, because it turns out that when you plan these things, you end up having to, in the couple of years between JDK 8 and the scheduled release of JDK 9, we had to drop some things. A couple of minor increases came out, but overall, you could have asked me in Java 1 2002, can you show us the roadmap for the next couple of releases of the JDK? And I would have produced a slide that had some dates and some features. And in hindsight, when I look at the slides, it was mostly fiction because we didn't hit the dates. We switched the features around. And what's more, it was very painful and difficult. It meant that we were not very responsive. If you came with a new feature, and this is super urgent, and hey, how lucky is it that we have a major version coming out in 6 months? Why don't you put it there? The answer was, of course, yeah, that release is closed, right? We're not adding new features to that release. So yeah, it's very important. Let's talk about it, 30 months from now. And then nobody wanted to give me any feedback anymore because by then, you'll have different problems. This is the OpenJDK page of JDK 9. Look at the feature complete date and compare it to the GA date, okay? I know it's very small, so I'm going to read it for you. Feature complete, that was May of 2016. GA date, September of 2017. What was going on between those two? We were stabilizing the release. And the reason for that is there were a long list of features. You see the one at the bottom? They couldn't fit in one slide, so I had to scroll them up, right? All of those things were brand new. They had never been seen before. Some of them required some major changes to the JVM, to the libraries, to the language. Actually, I don't think we had changes to the language in 9. We had them on 8. But that was a massive thing, right? So of course, you need all of these things coming together. They were delivered by the teams working on them at different times, so it's not like we could just have a nice long period of stabilization. We kept adding things at it, and that's what you end up with, right? Notice the GA build. We built 181, so 180 early access, if you will, builds of JDK 9 in all of the years that it took to build. It's the last major release. Let's compare that with JDK 10. It came out in March 2018. It's the first release under this new model. So even though in the roadmap you see 9 and it looks like that's the first one, come on, we all know that was developed under the old model, right? Now take a look at this one. 12 JEPs, that's a complete list right there. So one thing should be obvious, but we should hammer it. We're not producing the equivalent of another JDK 8 or another JDK 9 every 6 months. That's not possible. What we're doing now is we're taking smaller bites, right? Look at the difference in the dates. Ramp down in December of 2017, GA in March of 2018, right? Build number 46. To be clear, we were already working on JDK 10 before JDK 9 came out, so we sort of already had a few of those. JDK 11, the current version, September 2018. GA build 28, and only 17 JEPs. Same small schedule. The final release candidate that was created a month, give or take a month before the release, that was the GA version. There were no need to change anything. There was no need to rebuild anything. Now, how did we achieve this, right? We used to slip. We used to have to do a bare, you've all heard that idea that you shouldn't use version 0 of anything, right? Don't touch 8.0. Wait until the next minor update. Because, of course, you introduce some things that weren't completely ironed out, and you need to iron them out, and you'll do that in the first minor release. We don't have to do this anymore. It's not that we magically got very good at getting features ready. It's that now we don't have to put a feature into our release until it's ready. So all of that stabilization happens elsewhere. One of my favorite ones here is TLS 1.3. The spec was approved by that RFC number in August of 2018. And we produced a release that supported it in September. Anybody care to guess how long this would have taken under the old model? Best case scenario, you would have had to wait, I don't know, a couple of years. If a spec was released only, I don't know, 3 months before a GA, too late. We weren't ready on that version. You have to go on to the next one, right? Now, yeah, I mean, this is very lucky timing. This won't happen very often. But now, at least for certain features, we have the option of providing you with something quickly. JDK 12. Now, here's where it gets interesting. It has 4 JEPs so far, right? If you check this page in December, it may have 5 or 6, or it might continue to be 4. I don't know. So that's one of the questions that I get the most from our sales teams. Where's now the Java roadmap? And I have a very nice roadmap that has all the version numbers and no features in it. Can you tell me the features? Sure can. When? A month or 2 before the release. Okay? Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we're just winging it. We do have some projects that we know we're working on, and we do have a list of things that might make it into the next release. I, for one, thought that raw string literals was going to make JDK 11. And, a bunch of us did. And it never did. Now, that was never assigned to JDK 11 because, we thought we were going to make it. We were off by a couple of weeks. It's not a big deal, right? We'd rather have something well done 6 months later than rush something in and then provide you with something that's not quite ready. Now, we also introduced some new tools. We realized, okay, we're going to start introducing changes, right? And one of the problems that we have is sometimes I can tell you guys things like, don't use internal APIs, right? And let's assume you're all very diligent and, keep your code very clean of internal APIs. That's great, but then you go and grab some third-party library, and they use internal APIs. And you own all of the vices and the virtues of all the libraries that you bring into your product. So now your product has the use of internal APIs, and it may break when I try to upgrade it past JDK 8. How do you guys know about that? Remember, I'm trying to avoid surprises. And the old way that you knew when something broke is you try to install the next version, and it blows up. So we figured, okay, let's give you guys tools so that you know ahead of time when something might be a problem, so that you can have a release or 2 to take action and find an alternative library. The first thing we introduced was with JDK 8, a tool called JDEP Scan, which would figure out the dependencies of your application. This was in preparation for JDK 9. You can give it a jar, a class, a directory. You do not need the source code. You just need the bytecode, because we understand you may not have the source code. And it'll tell you which classes that package depends on. Now, this is a poor example. My favorite ones is when it calls out, this is an internal package. You shouldn't be using that. So if this particular jar was using some internal APIs, you'd have a special warning. You can even ask, I don't care about the long list. Just give me the ones that are going to be troublesome. And that will let you know ahead of time, yeah, this particular jar might not work with the next version when we start creating stronger encapsulation. So here's one tool that will allow you to look forward. Here's another one, JDEP Scan. Up to JDK 8, we had an annotation called deprecated, right? You go to the APIs, and you'll see that some APIs were deprecated. Now, what did deprecated mean? It could be, we want to get rid of this API. It shouldn't be there. Or it could also mean, this API is fine, there's just a better one, but we have no plans to remove the old one. Or, there's just a better coding style. There's for a form in Swing, you can have a show and hide, and we prefer that you use set visible true or set visible false. But show and hide will be there presumably forever. So if you're writing new code, use the new one. But if you have old code, that's fine, except in the case on when we're going to remove it. And how could you tell? Well, you could go into the Java doc and read the thing, and then you would be able to tell which case you were in. And how many people do that? So we figured we need the tools to be able to tell you and distinguish this. In JDK 9, we introduced another annotation for deprecation that is for removal equals true. And the purpose of that is not just to give you a little bit more information. Now we have tools that we can call out and say, analyze the code and find not just the deprecated ones, which is something I should work to fix, but pinpoint the ones that are for removal equals true. Those APIs might not be there in the next version of Java. So that means that might be a problematic library. Go look into it. And now you have at least one release. And I say at least one release because if something is widely used and we're going to deprecate it, we're going to give you more than one release. But the contract says at least one. Now you have a tool. Go run JDepreScan, even if you don't intend to grab the next version. It's just a way of finding, with some time ahead of time, whether something is going to blow up in your face or not. From the other side, it's not only about removing. We used to have this model where we come up with a new API, and where would you see it? Well, we had an early access of JDK 9 right after or right before the release of JDK 8. You were supposed to grow and grab that early access and provide us feedback. Now, the problem is we were jumping off the pool and then hoping that there would be water at the end, right? We had already scheduled it. It's going to go on JDK 9. And we hope we'll get enough feedback. And we have a very limited window. It's about 2 years. If people don't grab it and don't test it, it'll just go out without that much feedback, or it'll have to be kicked out. The point is most people saw it for the first time ever on a full JDK as part of the spec. And it's really hard to change it. And there's certain APIs that you're not going to get right if you don't get feedback. How can we fix that? Well, tell you what, let's start bringing in APIs that we know need a little feedback into the JDK. Now, that's very dangerous because I don't want you using that without knowing, right? So what did we do? Okay, for APIs, we created a new module called Incubator. Anything that goes into the Incubator module, we're pretty sure it's right, but we're afraid that without feedback, it's not yet ready for everybody to start building stuff that will be supported for the next 5 or 6 or 7 years. So HTTP 2, when was it available in the JDK? If you look at the JEPs for 11, they'll say that's where we introduced HTTP 2. It was introduced in JDK 9 as an incubator module. And the deal with incubator is it's not going to be there in a future version. Even if we got it perfectly right, we will switch the modules and they'll be in a different place. So yeah, go ahead and use it. If you're writing something that's going to leave 6 months, 7 months, or if you're going to try it out, but do not use it if your intention is to leave this thing in production for 5 or 6 years. Wait until it moves out of incubator module, okay? This is how we get feedback now. Well, we continue to have early access, right? Another one. Incubator module works fine for APIs. But what about new changes to the language, right? A new keyword or a change to the JVM. That's not in a package in a module. So now we have preview languages and VM features. So as an example, this is a new feature. By the way, this is cut and paste from the JEP. So, pretty easy to make slides this way. It's fully specified, fully implemented, and yet impermanent. This is 95 to 98% done, but we do need the feedback. And without real-world use case, we will never be ready. So it goes out as a VM preview. Now, what's to keep some developer from just cutting and pasting this into some library, and now you're using it and you didn't know about it? In order for a preview feature to work, you have to pass a flag. Enable preview, and you have to say to which release. So JDK 12 introduces a couple of preview features. If you want to use them, you'll have to pass enable preview release 12. And then you'll be able to try those out. Okay? And hopefully, for 13, 14, or 15, I cannot tell you until a month or so before, we will have these as actual changes, and you won't need to pass that. Okay? List of the projects. So, okay, now, before you knew what was coming by looking at the early access of the next version. Now, what's coming? Well, we can tell you which projects we're working on. And I'm not going to go into much detail because we have 15 minutes, but I'm just going to give you a quick overview. These are the next challenges that we're trying to address, right? Containers. We want predictability, especially in garbage collection. Improvements in performance. Data optimization. We've been working for many years to optimize code. We need to optimize data as well. And how do we store it in memory? Scalability and just continue language enhancements. This is the list of projects where we're putting most of our efforts nowadays. Don't worry, I'll go through each one of them. So, Project Portola. I think this is a pun because Portola leads to Alpine Road out here when you drive. This is a port of the JDK for Alpine Linux, which is a flavor of Linux widely used in containers when you're trying to create as small a container as possible, right? We've had early access of Alpine Linux for JDK 11 and 12. It's not a GA yet, but we'll continue to have the early access of the next version, providing builds for Alpine Linux until we feel it's ready. Proiect Valhalla. This represents, a typical class where I just want to put an integer and a couple of coordinates. Well, a coordinate, right? X and Y. And in memory, since everything in Java that is not a primitive is an object, since I had to create a class for this is how it looks like, right? I have a header, and then every single one of them has a header. So if I have an array, you see the amount of memory that I'm using that I shouldn't be. And perhaps more importantly, every time I do a garbage collection, those things move around. So I can never cache those things properly. This is required because every object has to have certain important attributes. In some cases, I don't need those attributes. If I do not need identity or mutability, I could just say, well, I'm willing to give those up. And then I can represent it in a more efficient format. And the goal is to have something that has the performance of a primitive, right, and the nice, compact representation, but the flexibility of a class. So what would int do? That's what we want these new classes to work with. Of course, you pay some penalty. They don't have all of the functionality of the mutable classes. They don't have identity. Project Panama. Who here has written any JNI? Okay, my sincerest apologies. I'm sorry. When they were thinking of how do we make Java interact with other languages, I get the feeling that the feeling was, what do you mean other languages? No. It should all be Java. And if you want to go into other languages, you should be really sure what you're doing, and you should really know what you're doing, and we're not going to try to make it any simpler than it can possibly be. So it's not really easy to integrate Java with other languages. Or if you want to write some libraries in C and you want to call them, it's painful. And it doesn't have to be. So we're working to make it much easier. Project Loom. Who here saw Mark's keynote? Okay, good enough. You got a pretty good idea, right? So we're trying to make fibers, and we want to make them virtually free. So, a better threading model. Project Amber. This one is my favorite because it's so easy to understand, right? There's just a few pain points in what we do on a day-by-day basis that could be addressed by minor improvements in the language. You guys saw var, the local type inference in JDK 10. That's one of the children of this one. So that's another detail, by the way. It's not that we have 6 projects that's going to turn into 6 JEPs at some point. These projects will father a bunch of different improvements as they mature. And at some point, we may see a major change, but we may also see incremental improvements in all of these releases. I mentioned that there was 2 of those that are already in JDK 12, raw string literals. That's the one where I can use backticks to create a string that contains line breaks, and you don't have to escape anything. If you want to try that, that's currently available in the JDK 12 EA. 2 suggestions. First, it's a backtick. It's not a single quote. I have to say, somebody had to point that out to me because I was just looking at the examples. I thought it's a single quote. I was called out and said, read the JEP. And if anybody cares, by the way, if you do have a backtick in your string, you can just say that the delimiter is not a 1 backtick, but 2 backticks. And then a single backtick will not be considered the end of the string. You could have 3, 4, as many as you want. If you have my type of OCD, you will try it, and you will discover that you can have 2 to the 16 backticks, minus 3 or so, before you start to get into problems. So any reasonable amount of backticks in your string, you'll be able to handle. Yeah, I tried it. Not 1 by 1, as somebody suggested. Another offspring of Project Amber, switch expressions. So the idea is we use a lot of switch as a way of creating a function like. This makes it a more natural fit. And you will see other improvements that are going to come out of Project Amber. Project Skara. Who here works on OpenJDK, not just uses the JDK? Anybody here? Okay, my many thanks. You guys care about it. The rest of you ignore this, okay? Because this is how the people that are working in OpenJDK, what's the version control, instead of using Mercurial, using Git. So you will never see the value. These guys will. Well, you will see it as it'll be easier to bring more people in. And hopefully next time I ask this question, I get more hands. Now, what does that mean, by the way? Remember when I said we used to have all the features go into the next version? So for JDK 9, we actually had, for a while, a JDK 9 Jigsaw early access, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Most of the new features, if you wanted to try them ahead of time, you would have to patiently wait until they were integrated to some future release. And from that point on, you could test them, but you would also get as a bonus every other change in every other feature. So it was a bit of a noisy thing to try out one particular feature, right? Those early access incorporated early access for everything else. So you never knew if something broke, if it was something in your code, in the new feature, or in some other unrelated feature. So the good news now is if you want to try the early access of, say, Valhalla, we do have an early access of just Valhalla. Trick question. Well, when will then Valhalla be added to JDK 13 or 14 or 15 or whatever? Anybody? Whenever it's ready, and probably a feature at a time, right? We'll drop some functionality into those releases. So we don't have an early access for every single possible project. That would just be too much. But for the ones on which we're looking for feedback, we'll put it in there. Now here's the trick, right? If you like a feature and you would like to see it, guess what we need? That's what we put it in there for. We need your feedback, okay? We also have an early access for the next feature release. Those are surprisingly stable. So if you were used to having to wait a long time, you don't have to. If you want to make sure that your application works in production, some people say like, oh, there's no overlap, by the way. We had JDK 11 early access in its current form, right? Same as JDK 11 for 1 month. So try JDK 12, do not wait until the next major. And I'm just going to echo what Mark said during the keynote. Please, even if you decide, I don't care too much about the non-LTS releases, and I'm just going to wait for the other ones, all of these warnings and all of these messages and all of these tools will we are there to try to keep you from being surprised by a change in the next major version when you don't have much time to implement it. Please use them, okay? Do try your code, even if you have no intention of deploying it. Try to compile it with the next version, run those tools, and therefore you'll be prepared, sometimes with years of warning, before something might break one of the libraries that you're relying on. And with that, oh yeah, also, now give me feedback. I can use it. I understand before when I asked for feedback and I said 30 months, you know, you never wanted to talk to me again. Now I have much more, you know, well, not me, the whole OpenJDK community. Now we really need your feedback. So all of this effort is to give us flexibility. Without getting some feedback, it's wasted and we'll continue just guessing. We don't want to do that, okay? We may have time for a couple of questions. We have 5 minutes. And I don't know if you want to, I don't know how loud you want to be, but if you want to.
The JRE is still on version 8 on the website. Will the JRE continue to be supported, and will that be upgraded? And then will there be a subscription model for that as well?
Sure. So, okay, let me summarize then. If you look at the, I'm going to rephrase it.
Sure.
If you look at JDK 11, there is no JRE. You're wondering, will there ever be a JRE 11?
Yes, I noticed that.
Yeah. So we used to offer the JDK for developers and the JRE for people that just wanted to run the application but didn't want to develop. And the most important differences was that the JRE included the deployment stack, which allow you to launch a Java application from a web browser. So that's applets and web start applications. The JRE also allowed for auto-update. Now, we've deprecated for removal in 9 and removed in 11 web start and applets. And there is no more auto-update. So there is no classic JRE anymore. All of the things that we were removing, the important stuff, it's gone from the JDK. Now, that doesn't mean that you do not, you know, that there is no use for a common shared runtime that a bunch of applications can use, but for that, you can use the full JDK now. If you want to subset the JDK with JLink, introduced in JDK 9, you could specify and say, here's the modules that my applications need. I'm going to use JLink, spit out a smaller version of the JDK, and use that instead as a, you know, custom-made runtime. And in case you're wondering which modules do I need, JDEPs. If you run it against your applications, it'll tell you which modules it's using. Of course, unless you're using reflection, in which case, you know, you're on your own.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any more?
How do preview releases impact the specification?
The question is, how do preview releases impact the specification? Preview releases do not, you know, they impact them as in the feedback you give us will help us figure out what the proper API should look like whenever they go into a specification. So you should not assume that what's in a preview release is how it will be implemented at a GA version if it ever comes. Okay? But of course, if you see us changing the preview on feedback, that means that the, you know, specification when it comes out is probably going to be closer aligned to the new flavors. Okay? Okay, in that case, with 1 minute to go, I hope you enjoyed the rest of Oracle Code 1 and that you have a great rest of the day here in San Francisco.